The sun was bleeding itself dry across the western sky when Wade Carrick rode back toward his land. The wind dragged ribbons of red dust across the dying grass, and the leather of his saddle creaked like an old man's bones. His horse, Ranger, was thin but loyal, the last living thing that had stuck by him after the drought burned his ranch to near ruin. Weeks of day labor had left Wade's hands raw and his back bent. He'd been fencing for another rancher down near the river just to earn enough money for feed and nails. He didn't talk much. Folks in town called him the quiet one, the man who'd lost too much to still believe in luck. The trail home wound through the Badlands, past skeleton trees and dry creek beds that hadn't seen rain in months. When he crested the final hill, the old ranch came into view, a single cabin leaning against a line of dead mesquite, smokestack broken, fence half fallen. Still, it was home. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching over dust and dry leaves. "We made it, old boy," he murmured, patting Ranger's neck. The horse flicked his ear as if to say, "We always do." Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and loneliness. Wade reached for the old lantern by the door, struck a match, and the flame shivered to life. The familiar walls glowed in amber light, the chair by the hearth, the rifle rack, his father's weathered hat still hanging on the hook. But something was wrong. The room felt warm, too warm. The ashes in the fireplace were still glowing. He froze. His instincts, sharpened by years of living alone on the edge of nowhere, kicked in. One hand slid toward the rifle leaning by the door. He listened. Then he saw it. The shape on his bed. At first, he thought it was the light playing tricks, but when he stepped closer, the breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, thin, dust-covered, trembling even in her sleep. Her dark hair spilled across his blanket, tangled with sand. The skin around her mouth was cracked and sunburned, her bare feet wrapped in torn cloth. Wade's first thought was danger. Maybe she was bait, a setup for a robbery. He'd heard stories of outlaws leaving injured women in cabins to lure lonely men to their deaths. But then she made a sound, a weak, broken whisper, and something inside him shifted. It wasn't a trick. It was pain. He stood there for a long moment, the gun heavy in his hand, the firelight flickering across his face. Then, with a sigh that came from somewhere deep, he lowered the rifle. "You picked the wrong place to fall, miss," he muttered quietly, voice rough like gravel. Wade crossed the room, filled a tin cup with water, and knelt beside her. Her skin was hot with fever, pulse faint as the wind outside. He dipped a rag into the cup and pressed it to her forehead. She flinched, eyes fluttering open just enough for him to see, dark, fearful, and full of something he hadn't seen in years, trust. She whispered something he didn't understand, words soft, foreign, and carried by the edge of sleep. Then she drifted back into silence. Wade sat back, staring at her for a long while. The lantern flame danced, painting the room gold and shadow. In the stillness, the ranch no longer felt empty. He didn't know who she was or why fate had driven her to his doorstep. But as he added another log to the fire and listened to her shallow breathing, he felt it, a strange, quiet stirring in his chest. After months of dust and silence, life had returned to the ranch. And Wade Carrick had no idea it was about to change everything. The night fell thick and windless, the kind that made the land feel endless and godless. Wade Carrick stirred the coals in the old iron stove until the fire caught again, throwing warm orange light across the cabin walls. The woman on his bed hadn't moved since he found her. Her breathing came shallow, her lips cracked from thirst. Wade poured a little water into a tin cup, his rough hands trembling just slightly as he lifted her head. "Easy now," he murmured, voice low and gravelly. "Just a sip." The water slid past her lips and she swallowed weakly, a small sound escaping her throat, half relief, half pain. Then she spoke. It wasn't English. The words came out soft and strange, lilting like a prayer carried by the wind. Before he could ask what she meant, her eyes rolled shut again, and she slipped into a fevered sleep. Wade sat back, frowning. He'd heard enough tongues out here to recognize that voice. It wasn't Spanish, nor was it from any settler's kind. It was Apache. For a moment, the air left his chest. Every man in these parts knew what that meant. If the town found her here, on his land, under his roof, they'd call him a traitor. Harboring an Apache was as good as signing your own death warrant. He looked at her again, her skin marked by sun and struggle, her wrists bruised where the cloth had rubbed raw. Whoever she was, she hadn't come here by choice. Wade raked a hand through his hair and cursed under his breath. Hell, Carrick, you've done it now. He should have left her where she lay. Should have turned that horse around and ridden for Sheriff Boone before the night turned. But he couldn't. Not after seeing those eyes, frightened, yet still fighting to stay alive. He fetched a rag from the wash basin, dipped it in the warm water, and cleaned the dirt from her forehead. Beneath the grime, her skin was soft, her cheekbones sharp and proud. She had the look of the desert about her, tough, resilient, and unbroken. Outside, a coyote howled across the canyon. Ranger snorted from the corral, restless. The sound of wind pressing through the cracks made the place feel smaller than it was. Wade sat near the hearth, boots planted wide, rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He watched her chest rise and fall. The faint rhythm reminded him of how long it had been since something living had shared this cabin with him. Hours passed. He didn't sleep. The flames flickered low, throwing shadows across the floor. In the wavering light, her face looked peaceful for a moment, almost childlike. Wade's mind wandered, back to a time when his ranch had been full of noise, the clatter of hooves, the laughter of men, the crack of his father's voice calling orders. That world was gone now, swallowed by drought and debt. Now, this stranger, this Apache woman, lay where emptiness once lived. He didn't understand why, but some part of him felt like she'd been brought here for a reason. When she stirred near midnight, mumbling something he couldn't grasp, he reached over instinctively and brushed the sweat from her brow. Her skin burned hot, fever climbing high. He whispered, "You hold on now, you hear me?" Her lips moved again, forming a single faint sound that might have been a name. Then she stilled, her breath soft as the wind beyond the door. Wade leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He stared at the lantern until its flame turned to a quiet glow. Somewhere outside, a wolf answered the coyote's call, and for the first time in months, the sound didn't feel lonely. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know her story, but the moment he looked at her, something old and broken inside him began to stir. In a land where mercy could get a man killed, Wade Carrick chose it anyway. And before the night was done, the desert itself seemed to breathe differently, like it knew life had found its way back into his home. Morning came slow and golden over the desert, the kind of dawn that crept in quiet and patient. Sunlight spilled through the cracks of Wade Carrick's old cabin, brushing against the walls like a promise that maybe, just maybe, the night had passed. Wade had dozed off in the chair by the stove, rifle still propped against his knee. The fire had burned down to soft embers, painting everything in a copper haze. He blinked awake at the faint sound of movement, a shift of fabric, a soft breath. The woman was awake. Her eyes darted around the room, wild at first, like a cornered deer ready to flee. Wade raised both hands slightly, palms open. "Easy," he said in a low drawl. "Ain't no one gonna hurt you here." She didn't understand, not the words, maybe not even the tone, but she froze, wary and trembling. Wade pointed at his chest. "Wade." He said it slowly, firmly. Then he pointed toward her, eyebrows raised. "You." For a moment, she said nothing. Then her lips parted, the word small but clear. "Ahayoka." Wade repeated it under his breath. "Ahayoka." It felt strange in his mouth, foreign but soft, like the sound of wind sliding over sand. She nodded once, cautious, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear this time, maybe recognition. He poured a bit of broth into a bowl and set it near her. "Eat," he said gently, tapping the spoon. She hesitated, then took it, her hands shaking as she lifted it to her lips. The first taste seemed to surprise her. She paused, looked at him, then took another spoonful, slower this time. Wade leaned back in his chair, arms folded, watching the steam rise from the bowl. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was new, curious, a quiet language built on glances and small gestures. When she'd finished, she whispered something in Apache, words Wade couldn't make sense of, but the tone carried gratitude. He just nodded, pretending he understood. He stepped outside to fetch water. The desert air hit him, cool and clean after the long night. The sky stretched wide and endless, clouds drifting like white ghosts. Ranger nickered softly from the corral, and Wade rubbed the horse's muzzle. "Got company, old boy," he murmured. "Didn't plan on it, but I reckon fate didn't ask." By noon, Ahayoka had managed to stand. Her steps were unsteady, but her will was clear. She tried to sweep the cabin, gather wood, even though her hands trembled. Wade stopped her once, shaking his head. "You ain't gotta do that." She frowned slightly, didn't understand, but kept at it anyway. Later, while he patched a hole in the roof, she brought him a tin cup of water. He took it, smiling faintly. "Thank you." She tilted her head, mimicking the word softly. "Thank you." The sound of it almost made him laugh. It had been a long time since anyone said thank you in this house. As the day wore on, a breeze rolled through the valley, carrying the scent of sage and dust. The sun bled low behind the red hills, painting the land in bronze and fire. Wade leaned against the porch post, wiping sweat from his brow. Ahayoka sat nearby, knees drawn close, watching the horizon. The last light of day caught in her dark hair and shimmered in her eyes, eyes that carried storms and silence all at once. For the first time in years, Wade didn't feel the ache of solitude pressing on his chest. The cabin behind him no longer felt hollow. The air itself seemed softer, filled with something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the sound of her quiet breathing. Maybe it was the way the dying sun turned the desert gold again. Or maybe it was just this, that for the first time since the drought took everything from him, Wade Carrick wasn't alone. The town of Dry Creek always smelled like sweat, whiskey, and bad intentions. Wade Carrick had been away from it for months, and still, it hadn't changed one bit. He hitched Ranger outside the general store, dust rising from the street as a hot wind swept through. The saloon's batwing doors flapped lazily, and inside came the hum of conversation, the kind men used when trouble was close but not yet spoken. Wade went in for supplies, salt, nails, flour, nothing more. But fate had other plans. At the far table sat Buck Carter, a loudmouth ranch hand who'd always had too much drink and too little sense. Across from him were two bounty riders, Clay Boone and Jed Skinner, men whose idea of law was whatever paid the most. Their voices carried through the smoky room. "I'm tellin' you," Buck said, slamming his mug down, "there's Apache tracks out near Carrick's land. Small ones, light-footed, woman, maybe. Boone's gonna want to hear it." Wade froze mid-step. His pulse hammered. "Sheriff Boone won't let that slide," Jed Skinner said, picking at his teeth with a matchstick. "He'll round up a posse soon as he hears. Ain't no one wants redskins lurkin' near their homes." Buck grinned, mean and satisfied. "Man like Carrick don't talk much. Could be he's hidin' something. Never trusted that loner since his herd died off." Wade forced himself to keep walking, boots steady on the floorboards, though his heart was thundering hard enough to shake the walls. He paid for his goods without a word. The storekeeper, an old man with cloudy eyes, handed over the bag. "You take care, Wade. Folks been nervous lately." "Yeah," Wade muttered. "Ain't just folks." Outside, the heat hit him like a slap. He untied Ranger and swung into the saddle, dust swirling underhoof. As he rode out of town, he didn't look back. The sun was sinking low by the time the ranch came into view again. The desert glowed copper and red, and the horizon shimmered with heat. Wade's mind replayed every word he'd heard. Sheriff Boone will want to know. Apache tracks near Carrick's land. He knew what came next. If the sheriff started asking questions, Ahayoka wouldn't stand a chance. He found her sitting near the porch when he returned, her hair loose, the wind playing with it like a memory. In her hands was a small bird, a sparrow, its wing broken and bent at a wrong angle. She was feeding it crumbs of bread, soft and careful. The bird trembled, too weak to fly, yet it pecked gently from her palm. When she looked up, Wade saw the sunset reflected in her eyes, warm, tender, alive. She smiled. Just a small, fleeting curve of her lips, but it hit him harder than a bullet ever could. For a moment, the world outside ceased to matter, the saloon whispers, the sheriff, the danger crawling closer with every breath. There was only the woman and the tiny life in her hands. He sat on the porch step beside her, the boards creaking under his weight. The silence was comfortable, the kind shared by two souls who didn't need words. "Good," she said softly, pointing to the bird. "He live?" Wade nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, he lives." The sun dipped behind the hills, and the land cooled under a purple sky. Coyotes yipped far off, their cries fading into the distance. The air smelled of mesquite and smoke. Wade watched Ahayoka as she wrapped the little bird in a scrap of cloth, her hands steady, her expression calm. He thought about how she'd come into his life by accident, or maybe something deeper than that. Trouble was coming. He could feel it, same way the earth feels thunder long before the storm hits. But as she smiled again in that fading light, Wade Carrick knew one thing for sure: if the world came knocking, he'd stand between it and her, no matter the cost. 2 days later, the sound of hooves broke the still morning. Wade Carrick was splitting wood by the fence when he caught sight of 3 riders kicking up dust along the ridge road, Sheriff Boone leading the way, with 2 deputies trailing close behind. The sheriff was a tall man, hard-faced from years under the desert sun. His badge glinted faintly on his chest, and his eyes carried the kind of sharpness that could cut through lies before a man even spoke them. Wade wiped his hands on his jeans and straightened. He'd been expecting this visit ever since the talk in Dry Creek. "Morning, Wade," the sheriff said, reining his horse to a stop. His voice was even, but his gaze was watchful. "Heard talk there've been tracks out this way. Light steps. Barefoot. You seen anyone wandering near your land?" Wade kept his face calm, his tone dry. "Ain't seen anyone but my horse, Sheriff. Just me and Ranger trying to make it through another dry spell." Boone squinted. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure," Wade replied, eyes steady. A long pause stretched between them. The only sound was the wind brushing through the dry mesquite and the faint creak of saddle leather. Finally, Boone nodded once. "All right. You see anything out of place, you send word. Folks in town are nervous. After that raid near Mesa Flats, nobody's taking chances." "I'll do that," Wade said. Boone looked past him toward the cabin, his eyes narrowing slightly, then turned his horse. "Keep your eyes open, Carrick." The 3 men rode off, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the air. Wade stood still until they disappeared over the ridge. Then he exhaled, slow and heavy, the tension draining from his shoulders. He turned toward the cabin, and froze. Behind the thin curtain of the front window, Ahayoka's face peeked through, her hand gripping the fabric tight enough to turn her knuckles white. When their eyes met, she stepped back like a frightened doe, vanishing from sight. He walked inside. She stood near the table, still pale, the curtain swaying behind her. "Gone," he said softly, motioning toward the door. "They're gone." She nodded, but her eyes flicked toward the window again, full of unease. Wade picked up his hat from the chair and ran a hand through his hair. You can't light a fire tonight, he told her. He made a gesture, hands out, palms up, then mimicked the motion of striking a match and crossed it out. No fire. Understand? Ahayoka tilted her head, watching him carefully. Then she nodded slowly. No fire, she whispered, her accent wrapping around the words like a melody. Good. And if you hear horses, he pointed toward the door, pressing a finger to his lips. Quiet. She mimicked the gesture, finger to mouth, and gave a small nod. The rest of the day passed in silence. Wade worked outside, keeping to routine, though his eyes never strayed far from the horizon. Every gust of wind that kicked up dust made his stomach tighten. The sheriff wasn't a fool, and Buck Carter was too nosy for his own good. That night, the cabin sat dark against the desert plain. No fire burned in the hearth, no light showed through the cracks. Wade sat in his chair by the window, rifle laid across his lap, listening. Ahayoka sat near the wall, her knees drawn close, watching the shadows stretch across the floor. Every once in a while, Ranger snorted from the corral, uneasy. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley, carrying the faint smell of rain and distant thunder. Inside, Wade's voice broke the quiet, low, almost to himself. World's got no mercy for strangers, girl, but we'll manage. She didn't understand the words, but something in his tone made her lift her head and meet his gaze. For a moment, neither spoke, yet somehow, they both knew. They were in this together now. The first warning came as a low hum rolling over the valley, that eerie sound the desert makes before it turns wild. By dusk, the horizon was swallowed in gold and ash, and the air grew thick with static. Wade Carrick stood outside the cabin, eyes narrowed against the wind. He could taste sand already in the back of his throat. Storm's comin', he muttered, pulling the last board across the window. A bad one. The sky went from copper to bruised gray, clouds twisting like angry smoke. The wind hit the cabin with a roar that shook the roof. Inside, Ahayoka helped him bar the shutters, her hair whipping loose around her face. The air smelled of dust and lightning. Then, a sound that didn't belong. A knock. Hard. Urgent. Followed by a voice that cut through the storm. Open up, Carrick. We know she's in there. Wade froze. He knew that voice. Buck Carter. The pounding grew louder, joined by the muffled shouts of others, Clay Boone, Jed Skinner, maybe more. Through the gaps in the wood, Wade saw lanterns flickering like ghost fires in the dust. Hand her over. Buck bellowed. You're harboring one of them savages. We saw her tracks. The wind screamed around the cabin, rattling the walls like bones. Wade gritted his teeth and shoved his shoulder against the door as it buckled under the force. You're out of your minds, he yelled back. Ain't no one here but me. Liar. Sand blasted through the cracks, stinging his face. He could barely hear his own words. Get off my land before the desert swallows you whole. Another slam rattled the frame, then, silence. The storm howled so loud it drowned out everything. Wade stood there for a heartbeat, chest heaving. Then he realized the quiet inside was wrong. He turned. Ahayoka? No answer. His heart lurched. The place where she'd stood was empty. The blanket she'd been holding lay crumpled on the floor. Damn it, he hissed. He grabbed his coat, yanked a scarf over his mouth, and kicked the door open. The wind hit him like a wall. Sand bit into his skin, sharp as glass. The air was a living thing, roaring, swirling, trying to knock him off his feet. He could barely see 10 feet ahead. Ahayoka, he shouted, his voice lost to the storm. Where are you? Lightning flashed, turning the desert white for a split second, enough for him to see a faint figure moving near the dry creek bed. He staggered toward it, boots sinking in loose sand. When he reached her, she was crouched low behind a boulder, her body wrapped protectively around something small. Ahayoka, he shouted again, grabbing her shoulder. She looked up, eyes wild, dust streaked across her face. In her arms, a tiny coyote pup trembled, its fur matted, eyes barely open. She had gone out into the storm to save it. Lord Almighty, Wade muttered, voice breaking between disbelief and anger. You're gonna get yourself killed. Ahayoka shook her head fiercely, clutching the pup tighter. The wind tore at her dress, her hair whipping like black ribbons in the sand. He didn't argue. There wasn't time. He threw his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. Come on. We're going home. They fought the wind step by step, bent low against the fury of the storm. Sand whipped their faces raw, lightning cracked close enough to rattle their bones. Wade kept her close, shielding both her and the pup with his body. By the time they reached the cabin, he was half blind, half deaf, every muscle screaming. He kicked the door shut behind them and collapsed against it, gasping. Ahayoka knelt by the fire pit, setting the shivering pup near the embers. She wrapped it in her shawl and stroked its head gently. Wade watched her, exhausted, dust-caked, yet somehow radiant in the flicker of the stormlight. You're something else, he said softly, his voice rough with awe. She looked up, smiling faintly through cracked lips. Safe, she whispered, pointing to the pup, then to him. Safe. The wind screamed outside, tearing at the desert, but inside that small cabin, warmth bloomed, fragile, defiant, alive. And for the first time since he'd lost everything, Wade Carrick understood. She wasn't just a survivor. She was part of this land, wild, untamed, and stronger than the storm itself. Morning came quiet, like the desert was holding its breath after the chaos. The storm had passed, leaving everything draped in a soft blanket of gold. Dust covered the world, the fences splintered, the barn roof half gone, and the ground rippled with dunes that hadn't been there the day before. But they were alive. Wade Carrick stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching over the sand. The air still smelled of rain and ash. The land looked wounded but strangely peaceful, like it had burned itself clean. Inside the cabin, Ahayoka sat by the hearth with the tiny coyote pup wrapped in her shawl. The little creature slept soundly, its sides rising and falling with the rhythm of new life. When Wade came in, she looked up, her hair still tangled, her face streaked with dust and warmth from the fire. Scout, she said softly, pointing at the pup. He raised a brow. Scout. She nodded, a small proud smile tugging at her lips. He find way home. Wade couldn't help but grin. Guess he did. He crouched beside her, resting a rough, calloused hand on her shoulder. You saved him, he said quietly. Hell, you saved both of us. She didn't understand every word, but something in his tone reached her anyway. Her smile deepened, gentle and full of light. For the first time in a long while, Wade felt the tightness in his chest ease. The storm had taken nearly everything he had left, but somehow, in the wreckage, it had given something back. The next few days passed slower, softer. Wade worked from dawn till dusk mending fences, patching the barn, and shoveling sand from the porch. The sun burned bright, relentless, but it felt good to sweat again, to work for something that mattered. Ahayoka stayed close, tending the fire, cooking simple meals, humming songs that floated through the air like wind over grass. Her voice was soft and low, a rhythm of survival that seemed older than the land itself. Scout grew stronger by the day. He followed her everywhere, tripping over his own paws, his tail wagging clumsily. Sometimes Wade would catch the sight of her kneeling in the yard, laughing softly as the pup gnawed at her bootlaces. That laughter, he hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of joy. It filled the spaces the storm had left hollow. One evening, as the sky turned crimson and the air cooled, Wade sat on the porch sharpening his knife. Ahayoka joined him, folding her legs beneath her. Scout curled up at her feet, already dozing. For a while, neither spoke. The desert stretched wide in front of them, endless, quiet, forgiving. Wade glanced sideways at her. You ever think this land'll be gentle again? She looked at the horizon, the wind lifting strands of her hair. Land not bad, she said slowly, piecing the words together. Only angry when people forget to listen. Wade thought about that, about all the men who'd come out here trying to tame the West, never realizing the West didn't belong to anyone. He nodded. Reckon you're right. The sun dropped below the ridge, leaving the world dipped in amber. In that moment, Wade felt something he hadn't known in years, peace. Not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that grows between two people who've both seen the same storm and survived it together. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Ahayoka stood, motioning toward the door. Come, she said with a faint smile. Warm. Wade followed her in, closing the door against the wind. Scout yawned beside the fire, curling into the folds of her shawl. The night outside was vast and dark, but inside the little cabin, there was warmth, and a kind of fragile happiness neither of them dared to name. Wade leaned back in his chair, watching the flames dance, and thought how strange it was, a broken ranch, a storm-torn world, and yet for the first time since his father's passing, the place finally felt like home. The days began to run together like the lines of the horizon, wide, endless, and slow. Wade, Carrick and Ahayoka settled into a rhythm that belonged only to them, a quiet understanding born not from words, but from gestures, glances, and shared labor. The morning started with the sound of hammering and the soft creak of old wood. Wade rebuilt the fence line post by post, sweat rolling down his neck as the desert sun climbed high. Ahayoka carried tools, held the rails steady, and pointed when he missed a spot. She had a steady hand and an eye for balance, not something she'd learned, but something born in her, like the rhythm of the land itself. By noon, the heat grew thick and heavy. They'd rest beneath the shadow of the barn, drinking from the same tin cup, sharing pieces of hard bread and jerky. Sometimes she'd try a word of English, testing the shape of it on her tongue. Hot, she said one afternoon, fanning her face with her hand. Wade chuckled. Yeah, it's hot enough to cook a man's boots out here. She laughed, though she didn't understand all of it. Then she pointed to the sky, tracing the clouds with her finger. Rain, come soon. He followed her gaze. You sure? Ahayoka smiled softly, tapping her chest. Land tell me. And somehow, she was right. That night the wind carried the smell of rain, and the desert breathed again. The downpour came sudden and wild, drumming on the tin roof until it nearly shook loose. They sat inside, watching the water streak down the windows like silver threads. Wade leaned back in his chair, watching her face in the flickering firelight. You ever miss it? He asked quietly. Your people. She nodded slowly, eyes far away. My father, chief by river. Good man. Brave. Soldiers come, take land. Burn. She paused, her hands tightening around the cup she held. Many die. 2 brothers, run. Maybe still live. Wade's throat tightened. Their names? Eli Tanner. Red Davis. Her voice was soft, reverent, like a prayer. He said the names back to her, careful with the sounds. Eli. Red. She smiled faintly. Yes. Good men. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Wade stared into the glow, picturing the kind of courage it took to survive something like that, to lose everything and still keep walking. You're strong, he said after a while. Stronger than most I've known. Ahayoka tilted her head, not understanding, but she caught his tone. Her lips curved into a quiet smile before she whispered something in Apache, words soft and melodic. Wade didn't know what they meant, but he didn't need to. The storm outside faded to a drizzle, and the cabin filled with the scent of wet earth and pine smoke. Scout slept curled up beside the fire, his little chest rising and falling in rhythm with the rain. Wade leaned back, feeling that rare peace settle into his bones. He didn't say it out loud, but the thought came clear as the morning sun. If she leaves, this place will be empty again. He turned his eyes toward her, Ahayoka, sitting by the fire, humming a tune that might have belonged to her mother, or to the land itself. For the first time in years, the ranch felt alive, not just standing, not just surviving, but breathing. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full, of meaning, of memory, of everything words could never carry. Outside, the desert slept beneath a clean sky. Inside, two souls, one broken by loss, the other by exile, found a strange, unspoken peace in the flicker of firelight. And though neither of them would admit it yet, something deeper had already taken root, something the wind and the storms could never tear down. The morning broke pale and silent, the kind of quiet that feels wrong, like the land itself was holding back its breath. Wade Carrick woke to the faint rustle of movement inside the cabin. The air smelled of coffee and dust, but something else lingered in it too, finality. He turned toward the sound and saw Ahayoka kneeling by the table, folding a small bundle of clothes. Her hands moved carefully, her face calm, but there was a shadow in her eyes that told him everything before she even spoke. "My people," she said softly, almost to herself. "They wait." Wade stood there, jaw tight, heart thudding slow and heavy. He'd known this moment would come. The desert wasn't a place to stay for long, not for someone still searching for her kin. But knowing it didn't make it any easier to swallow. He cleared his throat, voice rough. "You found them?" She nodded. "Far. But safe. Near river." The river. That word had always meant something sacred to her, a home, a heartbeat, a promise of what was lost. Wade looked away, trying to steady himself. "Well," he muttered, reaching for his hat, "you'll need water and rations for the ride." They worked in silence. He packed a canteen, jerky, a roll of bread, and a handful of dried beans into her satchel. She tied it shut with practiced ease. Scout, now nearly grown, sat by the door whining softly as if he knew what was happening. When everything was ready, she turned to him. In her hand was something small, a wooden carving, no bigger than his palm. It was a bird, simple but delicate, shaped from the pine scraps Wade had once used to fix the chair by the stove. She held it out to him. "Keep," she said quietly. "Remember." Wade took it gently. The carving was smooth and warm, her fingerprints still pressed into the wood. He tried to speak, but the words came out like gravel. "You sure you want to do this alone?" Ahayoka smiled faintly, her voice soft as the desert wind. "I'm not alone. Spirits walk." He looked at her, the woman he'd once found half dead in his bed, now standing tall and sure, sunlight tracing the edges of her face. There was strength in her now, something unbreakable. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "You made this place mean something again." She didn't understand the words, not fully, but she heard the feeling in them. "You good man, Wade Carrick," she said slowly. "Heart strong. Like land." He swallowed hard, tipping his hat low to hide his eyes. "Safe travels, Ahayoka." Outside, the morning stretched wide and endless. The wind carried the scent of sage and old rain. He helped her mount one of the spare horses, the same one he'd used to haul timber the week before. She looked back once, smiling through the light. Then she nudged the horse forward. Wade watched her ride across the plain, the rising sun behind her painting the world in gold. The dust from her trail shimmered like smoke until she was nothing but a speck on the horizon. He stood there a long time, hat in hand, the wind tugging at his shirt and hair. The desert was silent again, too silent. He looked down at the little wooden bird resting in his palm. The edges were smooth, the wings carved as if caught mid-flight. Something broke loose inside him then, something he'd kept buried since before the drought, before the loneliness. For the first time in years, Wade Carrick let himself cry. Not out of pain, but out of something bigger: gratitude, loss, and the strange kind of love a man only feels once in his lifetime. As the sun climbed higher, he whispered to the wind, "Ride safe, girl. Find your river." The land answered with nothing but quiet, that deep, endless quiet of the West that holds both endings and beginnings in the same breath. Spring came slow to the desert, gentle and quiet, like a memory trying to find its way home. The rains had passed weeks ago, and now the land wore a soft green tint, wildflowers pushing through the red soil as if the earth itself had decided to hope again. Wade Carrick sat on the porch, hat tilted low against the sun, listening to the hum of the wind sliding through the sagebrush. He'd lived through plenty of seasons out here, droughts, storms, and long winters that could freeze a man's will, but this spring felt different. Lighter. He still worked the land, still fixed what the wind tried to break. But he no longer muttered to the silence or cursed the loneliness. Because it wasn't lonely anymore. He heard her everywhere. Sometimes, in the hush before dawn, he could almost make out Ahayoka's voice, faint and musical, tangled in the breeze. At night, when the fire cracked low, he could swear he heard her laugh mingling with the popping wood. Even the creak of the porch board sounded like her steps. She was gone, but she hadn't really left. Scout, now grown into a strong, watchful creature, kept him company. The coyote moved like a shadow, loyal, clever, and wild as the woman who'd saved him. When Wade talked, Scout listened. When he was quiet, the animal rested his head on Wade's boot, eyes half closed, as if guarding the last fragile pieces of peace the man had found. One afternoon, as the air shimmered with the first heat of summer, Wade heard it, the distant beat of hooves. He looked up, squinting into the horizon. 3 riders came over the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. At first, he thought it was the sheriff again, or some lost travelers. But as they drew closer, his heart kicked in his chest. It was her. Ahayoka, riding tall and sure, her dark hair lifted by the wind. On either side of her were 2 Apache men, proud and quiet, Eli Tanner and Red Davis, her brothers. They stopped at the fence line, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full, heavy with everything words could never carry. Wade stepped forward, his voice rough. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Ahayoka smiled softly, reaching into her saddlebag. She drew out a folded piece of cloth, deep red, stitched with turquoise and white thread in delicate patterns that shimmered under the sun. She held it out to him. "For friend," she said quietly. Then, pressing a hand to her heart, "For heart." Wade took it, the fabric light and alive in his hands. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat refused to work. Finally, he managed, voice barely a whisper, "You brought life back to this place." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, they just stood there, a rancher and a woman of the desert, 2 souls bound by a storm and a shared silence that had changed them both. Ahayoka turned her horse, the wind tugging at her shawl. Her brothers nodded to Wade, respectful and wordless. Then they rode off toward the horizon, dust rising behind them like a farewell song. Scout barked after them, his tail wagging, ears perked toward the wind as if he, too, recognized something sacred in that sound. Wade stood there for a long time, the cloth still clutched in his hand, the wind curling around him like an embrace. The desert sang again that evening, not with rage or emptiness, but with warmth. He sat back on the porch as the sun sank low, the horizon glowing like burning copper. He thought of all the years he'd wasted fighting the land, fighting himself. And he realized, maybe the desert had never been cruel. Maybe it had just been waiting for someone to listen. As the stars came out, he smiled faintly and whispered to the night, "That's when my life truly began." The wind carried the words away, mingling with the faint echo of a woman's song, soft, wild, and eternal. And if you stood there, just close enough to the edge of his porch, you might have heard it too. Do you believe the desert keeps the voices of those we love, or does it only echo what's still left inside our hearts?